you can introduce yourself and the distillery to the viewers.
Absolutely. So my name is Alex Thompson. I'm the visitor attraction manager here at the Glenturret Distillery. I look after the shop, the tours, do a lot of the sort of brand visits and all that kind of thing as well. We are the oldest working distillery in Scotland. We're centred in the town of Crieff, just like right in the middle of Scotland. We've been making whiskey here since at least the year 1763. So we're pretty good at it these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's a little while. I think we were just becoming a country at that point.
I think so, yeah. That was just an idea at that point, yeah.
Sure. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you having us. I know it was quite a few back and forth to get this lined up. So thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
We appreciate it. Just to start off with, the idea or the concept behind this particular episode on this podcast that we're doing is based around the idea that we're trying to open more Americans' eyes to other spirits other than American-produced whiskeys, not just bourbon, but even rye whiskey and American single malts, but the world of whiskeys. So I'm trying to do multiple episodes based on that idea. So I may know a little bit more than some Americans, but I definitely don't know everything about single malt. So when we're talking about anything, talk to me like I don't know anything, if you will. Same for the viewers, so that if somebody's new to wanting to get into it, they can also be aware of the basics, right? You've been here, how long you said?
Coming up for 3 years. Yeah, I've been in the industry since I was 18 years old.
Sure.
Yeah.
So your grandfather?
So long family history in the industry. My 6 times great-grandfather was arrested in 1772 for illegally producing whiskey. It's the earliest reference we have in the family to it. And then in the 1830s, I think it was, another ancestor set up a legal distillery called the Grantley Distillery, which operated on my family's farm until 1910. Another branch of the family were involved in blending, set up Thompson's Blend in Perth, which there's still that side of the family are still a little bit into whiskey. So whiskey history all the way throughout the family. Interestingly enough, I actually didn't know about any of the family's whiskey history until I started working in the industry. And then I happened to mention to my grandmother that I was working in whiskey, and she said, "Oh well, your family used to own a distillery." So
no kidding.
Yeah, it was a bit of a coincidence, which is nice.
Do you feel like maybe it was a little taboo, or like they didn't want you to know, or it was just?
No, I think it was just we're a farming family, and sort of since the distillery shut, farming was the main focus. There was this is probably a lot of clues that I missed growing up. There was a picture of the old distillery hanging on our living room wall. We still have little pieces of the old still and all that kind of thing in my grandparents' house, and just in the way that you do when you're a teenager, you're not really that interested in your family's history until you get a little bit older. But yeah, so it was something I'd never really known anything about until I started working in the industry. So it was quite when I kind of found that out, I was like, okay, so this could be a career. This could be something pretty cool to get into.
Awesome.
So, yeah,
no, it's really neat to have that lineage and history and connection to such a predominantly known whiskey.
Absolutely.
Which for me, when I first started getting into it a little bit, was with bourbon, of course, but you quickly realize that Scotch whiskey and single malts were that's where it all kind of started. Even with our history of moonshining and running spirits and prohibition, there's somebody that has been doing it a lot longer than us.
Well, so many of the original moonshiners were Scottish people, that moved to the States, and you see a big uptick in illicit whiskey production in the States in the 18th century, and it's not a coincidence that in Scotland at that time we had just gone through the Jacobite rebellions, and a lot of men fled Scotland following the Jacobite rebellions in the mid-18th century, and these men that fled were rebellious people on the fringes of society, a lot of whom in Scotland would have been producing illegal whiskey. So a lot of these men, when they fled, when they went to places like Canada and the States and Australia, they didn't stop making whiskey, and they didn't stop making it illegally. So a lot of that moonshining history can be traced back to Scotland, which is pretty cool. So
that's really neat too.
It all comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
We like to say in Scotland that we invented the world. Television, the raincoat, all these things were invented by Scottish people.
I think that's the pride of any countryman, right? You try to take credit and be prideful about the things that your country's known for. That's awesome. That's a pretty neat connection between America and Scotland as well. So you mentioned in our walk around tour a little bit about the location. Can you go a little bit deeper into why here? Is there a particular reason in this particular area of this region of the Highlands that they chose this spot in the very beginning, you think?
Yeah,
or
so...
do you know, or what's the thought?
Whiskey distilleries are all very tied to their area.
Okay,
You know, our names are, as I said, incredibly geographic. So you'll tend to see a couple of prefixes before distillery names. So you'll see some that are called Aber. So Aberfeldy, Aberlour, you mentioned you're going up to Aberdeen. And Aber is like an estuary of a river. So
like a delta.
Yeah, so if it's Aber, it means that distillery is built at the end of a river, right? You'll see some distilleries that are Ben, so Ben Nevis, Ben Romac, Ben Riach. Ben is the Gaelic word for mountain. So the highest mountain in the UK is called Ben Nevis, out on the west coast. So that distillery really will probably use the water that runs off the mountain to make the whiskey. You'll see a lot of glens. So glen is the Gaelic word for a sort of narrow valley.
Sure.
So the distillery is using the water that runs through the valley. You'll see some that are called Strath. So Strathyla, Strathmill Distillery. We've got Restuarant Distillery just along the road. Strath is more like a big wide valley. So it's the river that runs through the valley. That will quite often be used for the whiskey. And then you'll see a couple that are called Knock. So there's Knockdo, Knockando, and Knock is a hill where a Ben is a mountain.
Okay.
So all of these are just geographic descriptors, basically. So distilleries are really tied to their geography. So you tend to find that distilleries are built next to rivers or streams. Sure. Because there's only 3 ingredients involved in our process: water, barley, and yeast. Right? Barley is reasonably easy to transport. Yeast is a microorganism. It's very easy to transport. Just let nature move the water. So build your distillery next to your water and use that. So we are located in sort of central Perthshire. It's not thought of as a big whiskey producing area of Scotland these days, but historically very much was.
Okay.
Where I'm from, and just over by Aberfeldy, there was a huge booming whiskey industry there in the 18th and 19th century, whereas now there's only a couple of distilleries still operating in the area. What's so good about here is we're in a reasonably good area for growing malted barley. We have abundant water sources, but the biggest thing that attracted a lot of distilleries to this area, especially in the 19th century, was our proximity to Perth. So Perth is our closest city. Okay. Not thought of as a big whiskey place these days, but really was one of the capitals of the 19th century whiskey industry. Dewar's, which I know a lot of your viewers will be familiar with, is the biggest selling Scotch whiskey in the States. Dewar's was founded in the city of Perth in the 1800s. Okay. John Dewar was actually from near where I'm from. He was from just outside Aberfeldy. Bell's, which is the biggest selling Scotch whiskey in the UK, that was founded in Perth. And then Famous Grouse, which is the biggest selling Scotch whiskey in Scotland. Sure. That was founded in Perth as well. Okay. So the Perthshire industry, as we know it today, was really geared towards the Perth blending houses, basically. Before that, we were in quite an interesting spot where we're kind of the gateway to the Highlands. We're about as far south as the Highlands goes here in Perthshire. So we sit on the Highland fault line, culturally a very Highland area. Up until the 19th century, the predominant language would have been Scots Gaelic rather than English. So a lot of Gaelic culture in this area, and with that came whiskey production. So every little collection of farms would have their own distillery. So you'd maybe have, if it was a large farm, they'd have their own distillery. If it was 4 or 5 farms together, they might join together and have a distillery that they all shared and ran with the barley. But we are the only distillery in the Crieff area today, but you go back a couple of hundred years and there was periods where there was up to 8 distilleries operating in this area, all with local barley, all local farm workers running the distilleries. So quite a traditional whiskey heartland that maybe isn't thought of as such these days.
The water itself, is it coming from a certain source that you know of? It's a very pure water, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so it comes from Glenturret, our water. I can actually give you a taste of Glenturret water. Have a little drink of this water right here. So Glenturret is the water source for the distillery, but it's also the water source for the town. You need 3 things for water for whiskey, right? It needs to be clean, a good temperature, and readily available. Okay. That's it, basically. There are some things that are a bonus as well. Softer water generally is preferred. We're very lucky with that in Scotland. Most of the Highlands of Scotland especially is built on granite, which makes the water incredibly soft. Okay. The lowlands and down into the north of England is a lot of limestone, which makes the water a little bit harder. Okay. Doesn't make It doesn't make the whiskey any different in terms of its flavour profile or anything like that, but what it can do is harder water is harder wearing on the equipment, because you've got a higher level of calcium in there, which is going to damage your equipment a bit more. So the theory is that harder water will cause degradation of the equipment a little bit faster. But you want, as long as your water's good and clean, readily available, fine. So Lagavulin is our water source. Back in the day, they would have taken the water direct from the burn, from the turret.
Sure.
But nowadays it comes direct from the loch and it's piped down to the distillery. It's much cleaner that way.
Yeah, than pulling it right out of the river.
Yeah, you know, we can't control if a poor sheep's fallen in the burn 100 metres upstream.
Yeah,
because Lagavulin is the water source for the town, it's regularly checked by Scottish Water to make sure it's nice and clean, so it's good.
That's crucial.
Yeah.
Okay. We did talk about the year the distillery was originally, or you thought was traced back to roughly. Can you talk a little bit, you don't have to go too in depth, but just a little bit about the change of hands through those couple of decades over between the 1700s, 1800s?
Yeah, so we don't know when the distillery first started, as I said. We know it was the late 1700s at some point. For most of the 1800s, the early 1800s, it was farming. It was the ownership of the distillery. By the late 1800s, it had come into being blending companies. A company called the Mitchell Brothers, primarily, who were a local company.
Okay.
And they again would have treated it as blending stock, primarily.
Sure.
They closed the distillery in 1923, and then it was reopened in 1957 by a man called James Fairley, who was a local businessman. A couple of reasons why it closed. Prohibition was actually a big one, so thanks for that, guys. That was a big one, but there was various reasons. There was economic downturn across Europe after the First World War. There was a rising temperance movement in the UK as well. The government did toy with introducing prohibition into the UK as well, but thankfully it didn't quite happen. So when we reopened in 1957, Mr. Fairley wanted to build a brand around the history of the distillery, but the problem was we didn't really know what it was, essentially. What we had was a book from the 1870s that mentioned that Glenturret had been built in 1775. So Mr. Fairley took that, and that became the brand, basically. He subsequently sold the distillery to Remy Cointreau. It owned the distillery for about 10 years. They then sold it to a company called Highland Distillers, who then rebadged as Edrington. And they are the owners of Callan, Highland Park, and Famous Grouse. They owned us from the early 90s up until 2019. And they again used this date of 1775.
Okay.
Now they sold the distillery in 2019 to two men from Switzerland, who are now the owners. And they decided to do this research and try and, nail down the date for the history of the distillery. And so far, the earliest document we've been able to find that mentions the distillery operating here is 1763. So it was great. It was a bit of a nightmare. It meant that all of our marketing was out of date, so everything had to be rebranded and remarketed with the new date on it. But it also allowed us to figure out who the original owners were. We thought it had just been a small farm distillery, but we figured out that actually we were owned by a junior branch of Clan Murray, who were barons. So they were the Barons Ochtertyre, the original owners of the distillery. So it allowed us to establish a bit more of the history, which was fantastic.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question kind of feels right from that is, being that there's so many Scotch distilleries across the country, and even with America doing single malts now, what do you feel like Glenturret has to offer? What do you think sets it apart from some of the other distilleries that would make somebody be like, that's the one I want to keep buying or trying or have on my shelf all the time? So you could talk about the flavor profile itself, but also just the brand and as a whole, like what sets it apart from all the other ones?
There's a couple things for us. I mean, everyone has their USP these days. You can't buy being the oldest distillery.
Sure.
That's going to set it apart, and especially I think that resonates more with overseas markets a little bit than it does with a domestic market.
Sure.
We're quite used to old things in Scotland.
Yeah.
So it doesn't always resonate as deeply. Whereas I've got family from Canada and my partner's family are from New Zealand, and being able to visit somewhere or experience a product that has been around since the 1700s is a huge thing for sort of countries like that.
Sure.
The thing for us though is just we make really nice whiskey.
Yeah.
And it's winning award after award, which is fantastic. our 2022 version of our Triple Wood. The San Francisco Whiskey Awards named it as the best single malt in the world. Which that's our non-age statement introductory one in the range. So for that to win that award was huge.
Yeah, it's a particularly prestigious award for the US.
And it's, I always joke that, what we do on site here is we make nice whiskey, we put it in nice bottles, and we make nice food.
Yeah.
Which is, you can't really complain about that. But what you're going to find from Glenturret is you're going to find really high quality single malts in some of the best casks you'll find in Scotland, produced in small batches, no gimmicks, and with the provenance of a distillery that's been here for 261 years now.
Yeah. Do you feel like once they've tasted the product and it's like let the product speak for itself, you'll come back? We know.
What I like to say is that the bottle gets people in, right? Because you never judge a book by its cover, but you do at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
And everybody judges a whiskey by its bottle. So
many to choose from.
Yeah, we've got those beautiful elite design bottles, and that pulls people in.
Sure.
And then they taste it, and it blows them away. Our 12-year-old, especially this year, which is what we've got in front of us to have a taste of, is for me a particularly fine whiskey. It's blowing people away when you give it to them to try, which is amazing.
Ground up, and then we'll get our 1.9 tons of grist, and that goes up taller wooden boxes through into the mash house.
Quick question. Yes. So barley is the predominant grain.
Yeah.
And then what was the other grain? Grist?
So grist is the ground up barley.
Okay.
So
it's 100% barley.
100% barley. Yeah.
And is that pretty standard across the majority of Scotch whiskey?
So if you're calling it single malt whiskey,
it needs to be
you only use barley.
Okay.
So the 3 ingredients alone: water, barley, yeast. That's it.
Okay.
Nothing else. If you're calling it single grain whiskey, you can mix other cereals. So you can use barley wheat, barley maize, barley and oats. You do have to use barley. One of the legal definitions of Scotch whiskey is it contains a barley component. So there has to be some barley in there, but it could be 1% barley, 99% wheat. But it has to be called single grain whiskey.
I think there's amongst Americans that are trying to get more into Scotch, there's a little bit of a misconception because we use the term single barrel.
Yeah.
And then we have blended, which is not blended referring to the grain, it's blended barrels, right? Or small batches.
Yeah, so for us, blended refers to different distilleries being mixed together.
Okay.
So we use single or blended, and single means one distillery, blended means multiple distilleries, is how we use it.
Okay.
So like our Triple Wood, for example, this year is a vatting of 60 different casks, but because all those casks contain Glenturret, it's a single malt.
Gotcha.
If it has come from one cask, we'll always specify on the bottle single cask Scotch whiskey, but those are a little bit rarer than a normal single, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not only the single grain, but it's also the single distillery that it came from.
Yeah.
So it's got to meet both of those.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So the single part refers to the distillery, and it's the second part that refers to the grain. So the single malt, one distillery, malted barley.
Okay.
Basically what it means.
Got it. I understood that, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
'Cause I was like,
I have a funny video that I'll show you later that shows that even Scottish people don't always understand.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that later. Once I've got some phone signal.
So once the barley's been ground, it's malted barley, but the other term you use.
So when it arrives to us, it's malted barley. So this is malted barley. So malted barley is where you have taken the barley fresh off the field as a seed form. You've soaked it in water for about 48 hours, and then you've actually germinated it for up to a week. And during the germination process, the barley begins to soften its shell, and it actually opens up a little bit. It exposes the starch that's inside the barley. The term that's used for it, which you have to be very careful about how you pronounce on a public tour, is the barley has chit, C-H-I-T. So you say you've chitted the barley. Now when we say chitted, what we mean is you see that little crease that's opened up in the barley?
Yeah.
Before you malt the barley, that crease is not open. So you're basically opening the barley ready to grow, essentially. Now once you get to about 6 to 10 days of the barley germinating, we then call it green malt, and at that point the barley has actually begun to grow. Now what we don't want is for it to actually grow, because if it grows, it will metabolize the starch into sugar, and it will then eat the sugar. And the modern method for drying it is hot air. Just blow hot air on it, and that kills off the growth, and all the shoots fall off. The old-fashioned method of drying it is over a peat fire. So that is how you get the smoky flavour in whiskey, is you peat the barley, by burning peat, using the smoke from the fire, and it dries the barley, but it also smokes the barley.
But was the original intent or was the smoke the side effect? You were trying to dry it.
Yeah, the smoke
You
side
weren't,
effects.
okay,
Yeah.
so you weren't really trying to
it
make,
was farmers that were doing this, especially in the 16th and 17th century. It was farmers. Farmers didn't have the money to buy coal, and the woods were all owned by local lords.
Sure.
As a tenant farmer, you would have a right to cut a certain amount of peat per year from your lord's land. So you would use some of that peat to dry the barley as well. So we think of it these days as being the west coast of Scotland, where all the smoky whiskey comes from. Very much a modern thing.
or the Isla stuff?
Yeah. If you go back to the 18th century, pretty much every distillery in Scotland would have been making smoky whiskey, because peat was the abundant fuel source in Scotland. There's only really one or two areas of Scotland where there are coal mines, and wood was expensive, whereas peat was free essentially.
Okay. Can you explain exactly what peat is?
So peat is decomposing vegetation, so dead carbon.
Okay.
It basically is just plants die, fall to the ground, more plants die, fall on top of them.
just compresses.
Gets compressed.
Like a rock
If you
almost.
left it in the ground for a few million more years, eventually it becomes coal. As it gets pushed further down, eventually it becomes coal. But in its current state, at the top soil, it's peat. So you can actually see all the dead plant matter still on there. Stuff that hasn't quite decomposed.
Pretty hard, right?
Yeah. When we first dig it out of the ground, it does just look like mud. But you dry it into these blocks to get it to be able to burn. Just like when it comes out of the mill. 1.9 tons of grist. So just ground up barley. You've got three things present inside here. You've got the husk of the barley, so you can see it all sitting there. You've got the grit, which is the white part that you can see, and then you also have the flour of the barley as well inside there. It's important that we get the ratios right on this. What we're looking for is 70% grit, 15% husk, 15% flour. If there's too much flour, it will, when we add water, it will just clog up all the equipment. If there's too much husk, when we add the water next door, it just won't let the water through, basically. So we have to get the ratios right. The traditional method for measuring the ratios is this. This is a grist box, also known as a shaker box. So what you do is you take a sample of your grist, take the lid off, put your sample in, give it a shake. You take it apart, and you should have your three constituent parts spread between the three layers. And then all you have to do is take those three parts out and weigh them, and make sure you've got 70, 15, 15 coming through. It's a very high-tech piece of equipment. We do still use these at the distillery because they do still work. So we do still test our grist ratio coming through using those things. There is a computer system you can use for it now.
Yeah.
So that still works. Start off on the left here. On the left, I actually have some of our new make spirit.
Oh, okay.
So this is the spirit, obviously, before it goes into the cask. What we have done with this is not at 70% like it'll come off the stills.
Sure.
This is 63.5. So we have strength at stills, and then we have filling strength. So we add some water to bring it down to 63.5. The thought is that basically filling it into the cask at 70+% doesn't really pick up as much flavour from the wood. You need to reduce the alcohol a little bit. So we've added some water, bring it down to 63.5. But this is moonshine. So this is raw whiskey. So what you're going to find from here is the actual spirit character of Glenturret. Flavour wise, what we're looking for from our spirit is things like orange, lemon, lime, green apple. Those are our sort of key indicators of Glenturret spirit. We want it to be as close as possible. We want it to be the same every time, basically, but because we are an old-fashioned sort of handmade product, there might be some slight variations in the odd batch, but as close as possible. So your nose in that. It's quite creamy.
Yeah, there's a
There's a lovely fruitiness to it. Feel free to have a taste if you like. As I said, it is 63.5. It's a good start to the day.
Is this fresh from today's?
No, that'll be maybe a week or so.
Okay.
Yeah. Quite cereal. A lot of the cereal notes coming through in there. Nice creamy mouthfeel to it. A little bit citrusy.
Yeah, that's nice. I wouldn't have thought this would have as many flavors for being a single grain. as well, right, in my head, because we use a lot of multiple grains in
Yeah.
most of our whiskeys. So you're like, oh, what's a single grain?
Yeah, that's
white?
it. You know, we just use barley for our single malts, and barley. You know, the history of alcohol is the history of abundance. Basically, you make your alcohol out of what you have a lot of, right? And for us, barley is one of the most grown crops in Scotland, so it just makes sense to do it. And yeah, it's an incredibly complex thing that comes through. I think it's a thing that the industry's maybe understanding a little bit more now. There was so much emphasis put on quality of the casks.
Sure.
The casks are obviously hugely important to the finished product, but if you've got a good new make spirit, then actually the maturation stage becomes much easier.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're not caring so much about your new make spirit, then you've got to work harder in maturation.
Yeah.
You've almost got to hide impurities. Whereas, you know,
Well, we've seen that a lot in the industry where people are trying to hide things
Right,
by
okay.
not doing the right thing on the front side.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So they're, we'll just triple finish it to hide a bunch of things, right? And
yeah.
it's-
No, there's definitely more of an emphasis put on quality new make now. And actually at whiskey awards in Scotland now, you can actually win an award for best new make. Whereas before they would only focus on the finished product.
Okay.
I think what's caused that really is the just abundance of new distilleries in Scotland now. Places like Lindor's Abbey down in Newborough and Fife, while their whiskey was maturing, while it was hitting that 3-year period, they were actually selling their new make spirit, which was quite an unheard of thing for distilleries to do. So it meant people could get an understanding for actually, before it was in the cask, it's already nice at that point. So, you know, there's more of an understanding of it now, which
Sure.
is brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant.
So keep that in mind,
Okay.
what that new make spirit tastes like, and then go for your 12-year-old. And to give you a bit of background on the 12-year-old, casks that we use in Scotland, same as the bourbon industry, are all made from oak, but they are different types of oak, and we don't just use American oak in Scotland, we'll use oak from all over the world, but primarily we're using American oak and Spanish oak for maturation. The most common type of cask that we will use for our maturation is American oak casks that were previously seasoned with bourbon, or previously matured bourbon, I should say. So that's the industry as a whole. 90-odd% of the casks in Scotland are American oak that previously had bourbon in them.
Okay.
We're a bit unusual at Glenturret. Our sort of preferred style of cask is still American oak, still Quercus alba, but it was seasoned with Spanish sherry before it came here to Scotland.
Okay.
Where the American oak bourbon casks will give you your vanilla, toffee, caramel flavours. What you're going to get from your American oak sherry is more of a sort of orchard fruit flavours coming through there. The other type that was used primarily is still sherry casks, but made from Spanish oak, made from Quercus roba. And these ones you're going to get your dried fruits, spices, dark chocolates. Now, what makes this whiskey so special, for what it is the high percentage of Spanish oak casks that have been used in this one. For something like a 12-year-old, primarily you would look to do American oak because it's a bit cheaper, it's a bit more accessible.
Yeah.
This is, I believe, something like 75% Spanish oak. So it's not a cheap whiskey to make, this 12-year-old type of cask that you've used. But that's really just the flavour profile that we're focusing on. The other part of it is we talk about sherry as a catch-all term, but there are lots of different types of sherry.
Sure.
Oloroso is the most common one.
Yeah.
If someone says to you sherry, they normally just mean Oloroso. This is actually a mixture though of Oloroso sherry and Pedro Jimenez sherry.
Okay.
And if I can make one recommendation to your viewers back home, try Pedro Jimenez sherry.
I've never heard of it.
It's
I've
amazing.
only known of Oloroso.
Yeah, so it's known as PX commonly, Pedro Jimenez.
Okay.
They make the wine from raisins rather than grapes, so it literally just tastes like alcoholic raisin juice. It's absolutely fantastic, Pedro Jimenez sherry.
So would you just have a really small amount?
Yeah,
Just a small.
you'd have like a sort of 30 to 40 ml measure of
Okay.
it after dinner, after dessert. It's very heavy, and it's just fantastic. But what it'll do to a whiskey is it'll put these lovely like dried fruits. You get your raisins, your sultanas, dates, even flavors like nutmeg and cinnamon will come through from these casks, and really that is what has given this 12-year-old its colour.
Yeah, I was wondering because I've seen single malts, seen scotches that were not this dark at 12 years.
So if you're using American oak primarily, American oak is not a dark form of wood, right?
Yep.
So what you're going to get from American oak is paler golden colours into the whiskey. Spanish oak is a higher tannin content and it's going to give you a darker colour into your whiskey. So that colour has come from its time in the Spanish oak.
Okay.
Now, a slightly annoying thing about the Scotch whisky industry is distilleries are allowed to add artificial colouring to their whiskey if they want to.
Did recently hear about that.
And they're under no legal obligation to tell you, which is very annoying.
That is super annoying.
It's for consistency across batches, is the reason, basically. Because we do yearly batches, we don't really care if each batch is just a different colour, because it shows the cask influence, right?
Yeah.
So every Glenturret is natural colour. So there's no artificial colouring added to that at all. That is natural cask colour that has come through from there.
Now, on the sherry casks that they were used, obviously previously for sherry, prior to sherry going in, were they charred?
So they tend to toast sherry
Just toasted,
casks.
okay.
Yeah, so you will see some that are charred, but it tends to be a toasting.
So just a light toast?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a new thing in bourbon where they're doing a secondary finishing barrel, which is a toasted barrel. And they're releasing it as a toasted bourbon. So it's
interesting.
toasted finish.
Yeah.
So it did all of its things in the charred barrels, right? And then it'll put it in a toasted barrel at the end. It's a new, sometimes gimmicky type thing.
Well, it's that, and it's all about just getting as much out of that cask as you can.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you'll often see casks here that people actually scrape off the previous layer of char and then apply a new layer of char.
Oh,
it's called STR process, and that basically just rejuvenates the cask. So you see that quite a lot in Scotland now with recharred casks. But yeah, I mean, casks are expensive.
Yeah.
So any way that you can to extend the life of a cask.
Get some more time out of it.
Absolutely, yeah. But yeah, this for me is what Glenturret is about, basically. The new make still comes through, you still get some of that fresh citrusy note, but the dried fruits in there and the spice in there is just something else.
Well, I haven't nosed any Scotch yet that smells this good.
Yeah,
So it's a promising side for me. Because I'm usually just getting a lot of the maltiness and the typical lighter senses there on the nose.
On the palate for this one, it is a wee bit stronger than you'll find with a lot of whiskies. It's 46.4%. Whiskey's minimum 40%. This is 46.4. But on the palate, it doesn't feel that strong, and that's really because of the sherry casks. It gives it a nice body to it, but it doesn't feel that strong. But just the depth and amount of fruit you're going to find in this whiskey is just sensational. So let's lunge. Cheers. Enjoy. So good, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Man. All right.
And it hangs around, it develops, it develops into, for me, it's like dark chocolate, and then it develops into this lovely, almost like a coffee note right at the end.
I'm getting some of the roasty notes, like an espresso note there at the end. And this was, you said 46?
46.4.
Okay.
Yeah. It's amazing how much that 0.4 does make a difference. It's funny because last year was the first year that we went to that specific degree of alcohol percentage, and it is amazing how different, even just between 46 and 46.4 will feel different.
So. A little extra there.
Yeah.
I tend to like spirits above 100 proof for bourbons because they're typically so sweet. So I like them around 110 to 115 proof, right? Because to me they shine better because of all sweetness. Sometimes the 80 to 90 proofers are just too sweet for me. All you're getting is all the corn. But that's really nice. I like that.
This is our mash tun.
Yeah, and as I said,
a new piece of equipment for us. This is one of the only piece of equipment that we have properly wholesale replaced since the new owners came in. What we're doing inside here is adding our 1.9 tons of grist, and then we're going to add roughly about 15,000 litres of water. The water that we use comes from Lagavulin, just 3.5 miles in that direction. We're not very inventive in Scotland when it comes to distillery names. Lagavulin means lake of the rushing water, so turret is rushing water. That then flows into a stream, a burn, that is called the Turret, which is the one that runs past the car park.
Okay.
So that is the rushing water. Valley, translated into Gaelic, is Glen. So Glenturret means valley of the rushing water. So that's why about half of Scotland's distilleries are Glen something, valley of the something, basically. So Glenfiddich, for example, is valley of the stag, because the Fiddick burn that runs past is called the stag burn, because a lot of stags used to drink from it, and that's why the Glenfiddich logo is a stag.
The stag,
because of the distillery name, basically. So we use the water from there. We do heat it up before we add it in, of course, starting at about 64 degrees C. as we're adding more water, we increase the temperature until it's over 90 degrees. The idea behind this is that at lower temperatures, you extract the natural enzymes that are present in the barley, but you don't get as much sugar, whereas at higher temperatures, you get a higher rate of sugar extraction. We have to start it low and work higher, because if you put the water in too hot, it will kill the enzymes that are present in the barley, and we need those for production later down the line. Now, the reason it was important to get our ratios right is that basically the floor of this machine looks like this, right? This is one of our old mash tun floors. So essentially, a mash tun is basically a giant colander. So all these little straight lines on here are holes in the base of the mash tun that allow the water to drain. Now, what we don't want is for the water to just rush straight through the mash tun, because if that happens, it won't take any of the sugar with it. So by having the shell of the barley left behind inside there, the shell will settle to the floor and basically act as a filter bed, and it stops that rushing effect of the water just going through. So that gives the water time to turn the starch into sugar, gelatinize the sugar, and then carry it on with it. So the water will then slowly drip through the floor. We're going to send the first 8,000 litres through into the next room, and that's what will become the alcohol, basically. And we call that wort, just a rich sugar water. Any other water that passes through is the sparge water, and that's just the residue water, basically. There is some sugar in there, but it's a weaker solution, so we won't use it in production. What we do with that water, up into the tank above our heads, and that gets reused in the next batch. Nothing's wasted in the whole process. Come and look on the inside. It looks like most of the water is passed through, and we've got the ground up barley left behind inside there.
Yeah, it looks pretty dry.
Yeah. What we do with the residue of the barley is it goes to a local farmer, and the local farmer feeds it to his cows. It's all the protein left over from the barley.
Yeah.
It's very good for the
Isn't it? Yeah, and as I said, like, you know, the bottle gets people in, but once you try that,
So this is the 12-year
Yep.
unpeated.
Yep.
Where can people find this? Is it in the U.S. yet?
we are. We're available in something like 8 states.
Okay.
I can share the list with you, so
Yeah,
you can
absolutely.
put it out in the descriptor. But we're distributed in the States through a company called MS Walker. The main distribution hub is around New York, but we're available in other places as well. I was in Florida in June, and I saw some there. There's quite a lot of it in Florida. We're in, where else? I know we're in Vegas. We are in, we're in like Boston and Chicago and places like that as well. I won't lie, you're not going to find Glenturret everywhere, but that's almost part of the charm, you know.
Yeah, makes it neat. Well, knowing that I was going to come here, I did start looking a little bit before I left, and I couldn't find any anywhere. I didn't dive deep into ordering a bottle, but I'm sure I could have. But so right, so it's not particularly available in the Louisiana market as of yet, but I can definitely do my own research and help the viewers see where they can find some.
Nip over the border of Florida and you can get some there.
Yeah. Well, we get a lot of travelers from Louisiana go to Florida for vacation.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of guys will haul bottles back.
Nice, good.
Anyway, so man, that's really nice.
You're going to be tasting that all day.
Yeah. To say I'm impressed is an understatement. I'm really that's good. For the 12-year, you mentioned the peated versions.
Yeah.
You have is the 12 also a peated one?
No, so the 12 is only unpeated.
Okay.
So the full range, we have a triple wood, which is our introductory one in the range. It's unpeated, and that's a vatting of American oak bourbon, American oak sherry, and European oak sherry casks. Averages between about 6 and 9 years old, the liquid inside there.
Okay.
One of the tricky things about Scotch whiskey is if you put an age statement on the bottle, so if you commit to saying this is a 12-year-old whiskey, you can put older whiskey than that in there.
Sure.
So there could be 50-year-old whiskey in here, but legally you can't tell anyone. You can only put the youngest age on the bottle.
Okay.
So triple wood's a mixture, so we haven't put the age on the bottle, 6 to 9 years old. This is 12. We have our 15, which is also unpeated, and is a similar vein to the 12, but is a slightly bolder whiskey, the 15.
Sure.
And then in the peated range, we have our 7, our 10, and our 14. Now peated, just I'll explain that very briefly.
Yeah, please.
Right at the start of the process, we dry the barley to prepare it for making it into single malt Scotch whiskey. So we put it through what's called the malting process, soak the barley in water for a period of about 48 hours, and then we germinate it for 6 to 10 days. And it's the same in American single malts, and the barley that is used in the bourbon process will also have gone through a malting process as well. So 6 to 10 day germination, and that just exposes the starch that's inside the barley and softens the shell of the barley. After that 6 to 10 day process, we then have to dry the barley, and the traditional method for drying it is to dig peat out of the ground. Looks like thick mud, it's just decomposing vegetation. Dry it into bricks, burn it, and then use the smoke from the fire to dry the barley. So not only are you drying the barley, but you're also smoking the barley.
Sure.
And what that means is that when you then make the whiskey with that barley, the whiskey tastes and smells like smoke. So it's a bit of a niche form of whiskey these days, but it's the traditional form of whiskey. The biggest peated whiskey that probably will be known in the American market these days is Lagavulin. If you ever watched the show Parks and Recreation, Ron Swanson drinks Lagavulin. That's seen as like, he drinks it because it's like the manly drink and all that. And Lagavulin have been very clever with it. There is now an official Lagavulin release called the Lagavulin Offerman Edition with Nick Offerman's face on the bottle. So they've been very, very clever with it. But peated whiskey is, very few people get into peated whiskey at the start.
Yeah,
smoky
I still am not a huge fan personally. I like cigars, but I don't like them together.
See, I'm the other way around. I love peated whiskey. I hate cigars.
Wow, right?
Yeah, I hate cigars, but love peated whiskey.
We do have Ardbeg, which I know quite a few people that like peated whiskeys tend to go towards that. And I tasted that once, and it was super smoky. I was like, wow, that's a lot.
It's one of the smokiest you'll find, Ardbeg. But no, so for us, we do the split between the two. So half of our range is peated, half of it's unpeated, and it means that there's kind of something for everybody, really. Triple wood is light and fresh and citrusy. 12 and 15 are a bit heavier, more dried fruits and spices, and then 7, 10, and 14 are varying levels of smoke and different fruity notes in there and everything. But yeah, for being such a small distillery, there's something for everyone, which is great.
Sure. Personally speaking, what's the sweet spot for you? What's your favorite age? Range. Do you have a range that you tend to always go towards to grab as your favorite?
So I've been lucky enough in my time in whiskey to try some incredibly old stuff. I think the oldest I've ever tried was a 68-year-old or 69-year-old or something like that, which was actually really boring. It kind of just tasted like wood.
It's a lot of oak.
And I've things that have literally turned 3 years old that day and everything in between. And most of the whiskey that I drink would be between 12 and 21, 22 years old. Now, a lot of that is price, of course.
Sure.
There's a big price jump that comes once you get over 18, really. But what you'll find with whiskey is you can almost split flavour into two categories. So you'll have production flavour and cask flavour, right? So production flavour for Glenturret is these orange, lemon, lime, green apple flavours. Cask flavours are then your dried fruits, your spices, your dark chocolate. When it's young, it's going to be primarily the production flavour. When it's old, it's going to be primarily the cask flavour. What I like is something that's a balance between the two. So those teenage whiskies, those early 20s whiskies have that real good balance. What you will find though is that people who are maybe newer to whiskey and maybe struggling a bit with some of the youthful feel of some Scotch whiskies will gravitate towards older whiskies, because older whiskies have lost a lot of that youthful bite almost. It's why a product like Johnnie Walker Blue Label is so universally popular, because it's so incredibly smooth. It's such a nice whiskey that's so easy to drink, because it's older whiskies that are in there, so it's not got that youthful bite to it. Whereas if you're newer to whiskey, a younger thing, even like Red Label, might be a little bit harder for you to palatise.
I think we sometimes, I know exactly what you're referring to. So for bourbon, I feel like it's in the 2 and 3 year range, not at the 4 year or 5 year. We call it graininess. Like you're getting a lot more of the grainy flavors, almost taste too earthy. You're like, it needs more time in the barrel. So for me, with bourbon, it's around 12 to 15 year. That's the sweet spot for me. Anything over 18, because of how hot the rick houses are where they're stored. To me, it's just way too oaky, or the tannins from the oak start influencing too much. It gets bitter. So it is wild to compare, which we all naturally do, between bourbon and other things, because that's what we mostly drink. It's like, we find things in the 12 to 15 or up to the 20 year range. It's like, this is amazing. we would never have anything at 30 or 40 years old.
Oh no, totally.
It would just be an oak bomb.
Yeah, and
right?
the temperature, with the temperatures you guys are dealing with, and the temperature fluctuations especially,
Wow.
I don't think there'd be anything left in the cask after that.
Well, that's the other side of it. There's like this much left, and the yield is so small.
Yeah, and the advantage we have is it's kind of, it's an advantage and disadvantage at the same time. Is they reckon the average temperature fluctuation in Scotland is only something like 6 degrees throughout the year.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that's 6 degrees C. So
Sure.
your window for maturation is occurring during these temperature change periods. So if your temperature change is really small, your maturation period is so much further.
Takes longer.
And that's why for Scotch whisky we tend to do that a little bit longer. Because
That
of that
makes
temperature
sense.
fluctuation. Whereas that also results in a low angel share. So we're 1 to 2% a year. Whereas you go to like the Australian market and they're bottling their whiskey super young in Australia, because it's pulling in flavor quickly because of this big temperature fluctuation, but they're not getting that low angel share. They're getting a much higher percentage angel share. What you will find in a lot of these markets is because it's maturing faster in terms of its flavor pulling from the cask, it's not always losing the heat in the spirit. Whereas with Scotch whisky, because it's maturing a little bit slower, it loses the heat a little bit more.
Sure.
So hot climate whiskies can often feel a bit more youthful, even though the flavor profile is
Yeah.
there of an older whiskey. Yeah.
That's a good point. I also think that with our barrels being new charred oak, it's like this is the first thing that's going into them. They're getting a lot out of that. It seems like that can happen a little quicker too. A combination of that, the heat, and the different grains.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how different these spirits can be. Okay. Talking specifically about we talked about the region already being the Highlands. Talk a little bit about the difference between, let's say, Highlands, Speyside. We know the Isles are traditionally known as more of the peated sides, right?
So the regionality came about in a few different ways. One of them was legal, basically. We had a boundary line drawn by the UK government called the Highland Boundary Line, which didn't relate anything to geography or culture. It was to do with whiskey. It ran from the Firth of Clyde to the Firth of Tay. So Clyde is a river on the west coast, the Tay is on the east coast, and anything north of that line was deemed to be a Highland whiskey distillery. And it was a different tax status, whether you were north of that line or south of that line.
Oh, okay.
Now, what it incentivized was for distilleries in the lowlands to have really large stills, whereas distilleries in the Highlands that were operating illegally tended to have smaller stills. Because if you're making your whiskey illegally, you need to be able to move the still. Now, the still that I showed you in our still house is like a story and a half tall. Back in the day, that still might have only been 6 or 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
Because it needed to be able to be thrown in the back of a wagon and hidden. Much like moonshine.
Sure.
So if you're producing your spirit on a big still like they were in the lowlands, that spirit is going to be vastly different to what we were making on a small still.
Okay.
You're going to have a lot more copper contact. You're going to have a lighter style of spirit. So the lowland spirits tended to be light and citrusy and malty, things like Glenkinchie and Auchentoshan, whereas the Highland spirits tended to be heavy and oily. Other thing was the lowland spirits were able to use fuel sources like coal and wood to dry the barley, whereas in the Highlands you were only using peat. So the Highland whiskies were smoky, they were oily, they were medicinal in some cases, whereas the lowland spirits were lighter and fruitier. Now a lot of the lowland spirits were primarily then used for blending, whereas the Highland spirits were viewed a bit more as what was drank as a malt, because it had character and body to it a little bit more than the lowland spirits. You then have Speyside up in the northeast. So Speyside centred around distilleries like Glenfiddich, Macallan, Glenlivet. Huge barley producing part of Scotland. The whole northeast of Scotland is a massive barley producing part, but also abundant water sources as well. The River Spey runs right through the middle, and you've got hundreds of tributaries running into the Spey. So loads of distilleries there. They developed a style eventually of very fruity whiskies, and a lot of that was to do with the trade in sherry casks. So places like Glenfiddich and Macallan, they're known for their sweet and fruity whiskies. So when we think of a regional map of Scotland nowadays, the sort of simplest way to look at it is lowlands are light, biscuity, citrusy. Highlands, slightly more robust. Toffee, vanilla, sometimes smoke. Speyside, sweet and fruity. It's sort of the simplest way to look
Perfect.
at it.
No, that does make sense because of the ones I've tasted.
The annoying thing about the whiskey industry is the more you look into it, the more you realise that absolutely isn't the case. It's a bit like the pirate code from Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, the regions are more like a guideline than a set of rules, basically.
Yeah, guideline. Yeah, that's funny. Okay. No, that helps. I think for some side of my brain, as they are associate this with that. Talked about aging a little bit. Tell me a little bit more about your warehouses. We call them warehouses for American whiskey, which is basically just a place to store the whiskey. Or Yoles is on site, but most are not. They're in a centralized warehousing system.
Yeah, so ours are predominantly on site at the moment. We do have some stored off site, and it's two reasons: it's space and security, basically.
Okay.
We just don't have enough space. Where we're located, we've got a river on one side, a road on the other side, and a couple of houses, so we don't really have any room to expand, basically. So most of our maturation is on site. We call them the traditional style of warehouse is called a dunnage warehouse, and the idea behind that is it's stone walls, earthen floors, no temperature regulation at all. The temperature is just naturally regulated as the seasons change.
Even through the coldest part of the winter.
Absolutely, those places are horrible in winter because they're absolutely freezing. In summer, they are not hot, they are just kind of not as cold, basically, in summer. They never really get warm.
Still kind of cool.
Warehouses. Yeah, absolutely. So the casks will be stacked sort of 3 high normally, and it'll just be a case of put the cask on its side in a row, put some wooden bars across the top of them, and put some more casks on top of that. That's how they're traditionally stored. So that's dunnage warehousing. Smells damp and like whiskey in the air, you know. We then have what are called racked warehouses, which is where you build a big steel frame, like steel rack frame, and you stack the casks within the steel frame. That you can go a lot higher. You can go sort of 5-6 casks high. And then the sort of more modern version of warehousing is called palletized, and that is where you will just get a wooden pallet and you'll stand the casks up on the pallet rather than lying on their side, and you can stack these pallets. I mean, you can stack as high as you want, basically. There's an interesting thought in the industry at the moment, which we need to do a bit more research on, is we're stacking the casks higher and higher. The temperature at the top is going to be quite different to the temperature at the bottom. So how will that affect the maturation? So it's something that needs a bit more research.
Yeah, there's actually a lot that's going into that with bourbon, particularly because it's so hot at the highest points. So they're rotating with some distilleries where they move them around throughout the years, and some are particularly on purpose keeping it at that level and using those for particular sub brands because you're getting a whole different flavor, right?
No, and I'm just saying about where the casks are stored in most places. So most distilleries have now shifted warehousing off-site, or a lot of distilleries, I wouldn't say most, but it's a couple of reasons. It's infrastructure really, but also security. You know, if you're a distillery operating in the north of Scotland, but your bottling hall and your blending lab are in Glasgow, because that's where most people live. It doesn't make sense to store your whiskey in the north of Scotland. So they make the whiskey on site, they make the spirit on site, I should say, put the spirit into a tanker, drive it to a centralised location and store it there. So most Scotch whiskey these days is stored in warehousing sort of around Edinburgh and Glasgow.
So you would contract that out to have
So
someone store it
for these
you.
bigger companies, they will own the warehouses themselves. So for companies like Diageo and Bacardi, they will own the warehouses themselves that are in the central area of Scotland.
So it leaves the distillery in a tanker instead of a cask.
Yeah, so that's very common in the industry now. You'll see if you drive up the A9 up towards Inverness or Aberdeen, you will pass hundreds of tankers travelling south, and they'll all have spirit inside them heading south. That's the ones you want to do a Fast and Furious on and try and pull over, you know.
You're thinking it might be fuel, but it's actually
spirit. Yeah, it's much
yeah.
better. But yeah, that's a practice that's been going on for a long time in whiskey, even going back to the 19th century when blending first grew. A lot of the distilleries would still fill the cask on site, but they would ship the cask to Perth, and the cask would mature in Perth and then be blended in Perth. The other big hub of it was a place called Leith. Leith is a suburb of Edinburgh. I'll get in trouble for saying that because Leith used to be its own town, but now it's technically a suburb of Edinburgh.
Sure.
But sorry, Leithers. And Leith had huge amounts of warehousing, and we're blending and everything in Leith. So it's a fairly traditional practice in whiskey.
Okay. No, that makes a lot more sense because throughout my 3 trips to Scotland, I've not seen any rickhouses, warehouses near the distilleries. Like, where are they keeping all these barrels, these casks for storage? I guess they're a little more isolated or just not within the area of the distilleries. Okay, makes sense. Tell me about so you told me about the age range of the spirits you'll have available now. Are there any new projects you guys are looking at doing or getting into with either the triple wood or finishing or anything on the new horizon?
Yeah, so we do have some older stock as well. So we're always kind of tinkering around with stuff like that. So we have a 25 and a 30, which are part of the regular range of the whiskies. Last year we did a 35-year-old as well, which was a one-off release, one single cask, 35 years old. The year before that we did a 50-year-old in 2022, so that was distilled in 1972. That's some pretty special stuff.
Man.
Remember, I was given a sample I wanted to take home and drank it with my dad. And the realization that when that spirit was made, my father was 9 when that spirit was made, which is just amazing when you think of something like that. Something that is quite unique about Scotch whisky is getting to experience those things, and you try a whiskey from that was I said earlier on, like I tried that 69-year-old whiskey, and I'm probably quite flippant about it, but what was happening in the world 69 years ago. But in terms of us, like we're sort of constantly looking at things that we can do next year. So by doing our yearly batches, it allows us to be quite fluid with what we're doing. So our 14-year-olds that I mentioned as part of the peated range, that's a new product that only came out on the 16th of July. We've never done that before.
Okay.
We only started peating again 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So that would have been bottled at the start of the year. It's our oldest peated stock that we have, basically. So there's always new things that we're looking to add to the range and play about.
I do think it's nice that you have the peated and the non-peated option for people that are really just aren't into peated, and your brand isn't only the peated, right?
I think if our distillery manager got his way, we'd only make peated whiskey. He loves peated whiskey.
Yeah.
But this year, it's about 20% of what we're actually distilling is peated this year.
Interesting. You're talking about the really old ones. I've tasted some old stuff as well, and not necessarily old because it was barrel aged that long. It's just it might be a 12-year, but it was bottled in the 70s.
Yeah.
And I found that the things that I've tasted are that old taste completely different on the distillate side in the beginning, right? So we call them dusties because the bottle is dusty, but they have a particularly neat and nostalgic flavor.
No, 100%. The industry has completely changed. If you buy, there's a big thing in Scotland at the moment amongst Scotch whisky drinkers. There's a big thing for buying blends specifically from the 60s and 70s because they were just so much more robust back then, and it's a totally different flavor profile to what you're going to find now. Yeah, built different, exactly. And you get some amazing deals. Auction sites are fantastic for them, and you get some absolutely amazing deals. But it's a flavor profile that almost doesn't exist anymore. There are some companies that are maybe striving to bring it back a little bit. There's an amazing company in Edinburgh called Woven. Again, I'm going to get in trouble because they're not in Edinburgh, they're in Leith. Woven was founded by a couple of guys to be independent blenders, and they're looking to replicate styles of different blends and do more unusual things with blends. And there's a Scotch whisky company called Duncan Taylor who make a blend called Black Bull.
Okay.
And Black Bull's great as a blend because it's robust and it's peated as well, and it's mostly 50% alcohol, the blends that they're producing, so 100 proof. It's a real different style of blend. But even with what you guys will be used to in the States, like some of the stuff that Dewar's are producing is amazing. Like the Dewar's 15 is, for me, like what a blended whiskey should be, the Dewar's 15. And they have this range called the Double Double, which features a 21, a 27, and a 32, and those are just outstanding. So mostly in the States, you guys will see things like Dewar's White Label as the sort of predominant one, but once you get into their age range ones, they're absolutely incredible. The biggest thing you realise with the Scotch whisky industry is that once you get to a point where you think, right, I know a lot about the industry and all that, you realise you just scratched the surface, basically.
I don't even know, right? Yeah, that's interesting.
You don't know what you don't know, basically.
One more thing on that with the stills, you were talking about how they were built different, and literally the stills were built different then. You talked a little bit about the shape of y'all's still and
It's
what
distillation.
that brings to your
And the
product.
idea is basically it's
Do
how
you think
quickly or
if
slowly you turn up
you
the
found
heat.
or had
And what this will mean is that if you do a fast distillation, where you ramp up the heat really quickly, the alcohol that evaporates and rises up the still basically includes every viscosity of alcohol. So what you'll end up with is a whiskey that's quite oily and heavy. Whereas if you do a slow distillation, where you increase the heat very gradually, the alcohol that evaporates is the least oily alcohol. So what you end up with at the other side is a whiskey that doesn't feel oily and bitter on your palate. The slowest distillation in Scotland is Glengoyne. Their motto, or the sort of tagline for Glengoyne, is unhurried since 1833, because they do such a slow distillation. We're not that much quicker than them. We do about 9 litres a minute, is how we measure it, a litre per minute.
Okay.
Which is regarded as being quite slow. And the other thing is the still design. So every distillery in Scotland has their own unique shape of the still, and it's one of the things that gives us all different characters and flavours of whiskey. If you get to be a real sort of Scotch whiskey nerd, you get to a point where you can, first of all, identify the distillery purely by seeing a picture of the still. But secondly, what's kind of harder to do is you can look at a still and make a good estimation of how that whiskey is going to taste. So if you look at this still, right? This still, you've got the body of the still, which is just under the floor here. So you can see how much further down it goes. So the actual boiling of the liquid takes place inside the body here. This is what's called the shoulders, and then we've got the neck running at the top here. So in the body, we have a heating element that will heat up the liquid. Once the liquid begins to evaporate, though, it comes up and it's going to hit the bottom of the copper here. So because our shoulders slope in quite dramatically, it causes the spirit to have to react with the copper as it's coming up. That reaction with the copper creates flavour, carries on that process from next door. That reaction with the copper is going to give you flavours like lemon, lime, orange, green apple, pear. So for us, having these really drastically sloping shoulders, it means we get more of these nice fruity flavours. Once it then gets above that, it enters this bulge here. That's called a boiling bulb. The idea is that's a wider section of the still, and the air inside there is cooler. So the alcohol only just evaporated, and then it comes up, hits that pocket of cool air, and what that basically does is it makes the oilier alcohol, which has a higher boiling point, condense and fall back down, while the lighter, more fruity alcohol gets stripped off and it keeps evaporating. So by having that there, what we're essentially doing is artificially adding another about 3 meters to the height of the still. If we were to get rid of that and wanted our whiskey to taste the same, we would have to make the still much taller to replicate that. Once it then gets hot enough, gets above that, we'll move up into the neck. Now our neck is quite long, so again this heavier, oilier alcohol is going to struggle to get up, but also our neck narrows as it rises, and that means that the spirit is funneled into the copper, and you get more of this lovely copper reaction coming through. But everything about this still is designed to give us light, fruity, and sweet type of whiskey coming off of it. Goes outside, gets condensed, brought back into a big tank underneath our feet here, be about 25% alcohol at that point, and then over into the second still, run the process again. What we get this time is about 72% alcohol, and that is now a spirit we produced there. Totally clear, quick looks like water. You guys would probably know it as moonshine, what comes off there.
How and what that brings to your product. Do you think if you found or had access to some of those really old stills, you could maybe replicate that distillate and those flavors?
Yeah, you probably could, to be honest. There's some amazing people in the world that can do very clever things like that. You know, the guys at Forsyths are the sort of main coppersmiths in Scotland. If you were to give them a design for a previous still, they could replicate it for you. Or even if you were to give them a flavour profile, they could help you replicate that still. For our still, we've had our main still, our wash still, we've had that since 1976.
Okay.
No, that's a bit of a worry because we tend to say that the shelf life of the still is 50 years, and to help you out with some quick math there, that's 48 years ago. So yeah, we're going to need to talk about how we replace that in the next few years, and that's a huge project because you know your still is such an integral part of what your spirit tastes like, and you know for us we only have the 2 stills, so when we take out that wash still, however long that takes to replace, we're not going to be able to make whiskey for that whole period.
Hitting the pause button.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the other worry is, not only is that still adding in flavour, but it's taking away things that are in there, and there's a build-up of reactions on the inside. There's copper sulfate build-up on the inside, and what you have to think about is that build-up on the inside. How much does that contribute in flavour?
Yeah.
So if you just buy a wholesale new still, it can be the same size and shape, but it's never going to be exactly the same. So
It's like a seasoned pot.
yeah, exactly.
Like a cast iron
Yeah,
pot.
exactly. So you're always going to find that with distilleries is when you get a new piece of equipment, it's just trial and error for a little bit. So when we got our new mash tun in 2022, we had to change water temperatures, water volume. We had to change the amount of yeast we put in. We had to change the speed of our distillation and all that kind of thing, because just by changing that one vessel changed everything about the whole process.
Trickle down effect.
Yeah, our poor distillery manager is he's done a lot of work on things like that over the last couple of years.
Yeah. So one other question in regards to stills, I've noticed a lot with the pot. What we would call a pot still.
Yeah.
I don't know if y'all call it.
We
a
call
pot
it that as
still.
well, yeah.
Are there any single malt or Scotch distilleries using column stills or a hybrid where it's a pot and a column?
So one of the legal requirements for Scotch whiskey is pot still. There are obviously ways you can get around it, where you can have things like copper plates built into the neck that could replicate some of the column distillation. But for it to be legally called single malt, it's a pot still distillation.
Okay.
One of the other definitions of it, which is different to bourbon, is it has to be produced in batches. So obviously with a column still, it allows you for continuous distillation. Single malt has to be in batches. Now the other type of Scotch we make here is single grain whiskey, which is confusing because it's not one grain, it's a mixture of grains. And that'll be things like Cameron Bridge Distillery, North British Distillery, and those are producing using a mixture of mixture of cereals rather, so barley and wheat, barley and maize, whatever. And those are produced on column stills. So we do use column stills in Scotland, but only for single grain whiskey.
Okay.
For single malt whiskey, it has to be malted barley. The original column still, like so many things, was actually invented by a Scotsman. It was invented by a man called Robert Steen.
Yeah.
The issue with Robert Steen's still was that supposedly it had a bad habit of blowing up. Which when you're dealing with high percentage alcohol is great. The current design that most distilleries work with was then improved upon by a man called Aeneas Coffey, who was an Irishman. He was an excise officer and an engineer, and he developed the modern still that is used. But we were using them in Scotland and Ireland, going back to the early 1800s.
Okay.
But yeah, so there's still quite a lot of them operating in the country, but not for malt whiskey.
Sure. Okay. The pot stills are such a cool thing to look at.
Oh, they're beautiful.
They're a work of art in their
Beautiful.
own right, even with nothing in it.
Yeah.
We have some distilleries, Woodford Reserve. They're known for their triple pot still.
Yeah.
Willet, and if you've ever heard of Willet, you got a really tall, gorgeous, similar to yours.
Yeah.
Those are some of the coolest ones to see and look at.
They're just it's such an iconic part of the Scotch whisky industry now, the pot still, and it's a recognisable thing.
Sure.
Like a lot of times it's the logo that's used to represent the whisky industry. Pot still, basically, and it's you go to a distillery and a lot of it is very similar when you're talking about the malting and the milling and all that kind of thing. But it fascinates me just the variations you can have in distillation and how it will affect the final product. It's an art form and a science, basically, distillation.
Really is. It's an awesome thing. I'm glad people smarter than me got into it a long time ago so I could enjoy it.
Yeah, if any of your
See why it's called safe? There's a giant padlock over on the right hand side. Up until 1983, the only person that was allowed to keep that padlock was the government appointed tax inspector. Yeah. Up until the 80s, every distillery actually had their own tax officer who lived on site at the distillery and was responsible for overseeing the tax revenue for the distillery. They were given their own house at the distillery, they were given their own office and all that kind of thing. The least popular member of the distillery team was in truth, imagine.
I would imagine.
One of my ancestors actually murdered a tax officer in the 1700s. He fled to Canada for a couple of years and then came back and lived a perfectly respectable life after that. But yeah, he murdered a tax officer because he tried to shut down the family's illicit whiskey production. So, poor old tax officers, eh? The sort of Scotch whisky distillery, we still do all of our cask filling on site. What happens most of the time now is the spirit's made on site, put into a tanker, driven to somewhere like Glasgow,
filled into cask there and put into a centralised warehouse. So like if you go to some of the big distilleries up north, they have all their old warehousing buildings on site, but they're mostly empty in the modern day. Whereas all of our cask filling is done on site, and pretty much all of our maturation is done on site as well. So our warehouses are just about sort of 300 yards that way, just across the road. We're using a variety of casks here. So these ones behind me here, they are made from American oak, but rather than being from the bourbon industry, they are American oak casks that were seasoned with sherry before they came to Scotland. We're a bit unusual again in the modern industry. Most distilleries are using American oak ex-bourbon casks as their main filling component. We actually don't use a lot of bourbon casks, just it doesn't suit our flavour profile that we're looking for. It gives you flavours like vanilla, toffee and caramel, whereas we're ideally looking for more sort of orchard fruit flavours.
Okay.
And that's American oak sherry casks that give you that profile.
Yeah.
The ones in here just now, those are Spanish oak sherry casks. So they're much, much richer. From that, you're going to get a lot more of your dried fruits, spices, dark chocolate, and stuff like this. So
Now, what's the volume difference?
So 500 litres, 250 litres,
Okay.
and then American oak bourbon tends to be about 180 to 200 litres.
Yeah, the barrels are way smaller.
Barrels, yeah. So
Do you find, have y'all messed around with it may be obvious, but the idea that the more surface area versus a smaller surface area, so a smaller barrel.
absolutely, yeah,
Right.
absolutely. So there's casks here called quarter casks and firkins,
Sure.
which are under 100 litres. And that's almost like supercharging a whiskey.
Yeah,
basically.
okay. So-
Whereas if you're using something like this, you're recognising the fact that it will be a slower maturation process.
Yeah.
The good thing with these is, although they are bigger, it's almost a more intense form of wood.
Okay.
So it actually does balance out quite well.
And it's Spanish oak.
Spanish oak.
Okay.
The biggest type of cask we can legally use is, I believe it's either 700 or 750 litres. I think it's 700, which is called a puncheon. We can't go any bigger than that. Because, in theory, you could just build an entire room made of oak and just
Yeah.
fill it full of spirit. But we can't go any bigger than about 700 litres.
Okay.
This is actually, incidentally, where an expression comes from, and this is my favourite fact about whiskey, right? These casks are called butts, B-U-T-T-S, right?
Okay.
If someone ever says to you, there's a buttload of that, that is where it comes from. So a buttload is actually a scientific measurement. It's 500 litres is how much a buttload is. How good is that, right?
Today years old
Yeah.
when I found that.
All right,
out.
it's so
Thanks.
good.
That is
It's so good.
Huh.
You have butts, these are called hogsheads. We don't actually know where that name comes from.
Hogshead.
We think it comes from potentially sort of Renaissance era Germany, where they're making a lot of beer.
Okay.
The thought is that high quality Bavarian beer was marked with a hog's head on the side of the barrel.
Okay.
So that size of barrel then became known as a hog's head. We don't actually know, but that's the sort of prevailing theory
Yeah.
on it. But
Yeah.
yeah, a buttload, 500 litres.
Buttloads.
Brilliant.
I love it.
Yeah. So minimum maturation period for Scotch is 3 years. Anything younger than 3 years cannot be called Scotch whisky. You will hear a lot of people say that it's 3 years and 1 day. Any distillery tour that you do, the tour guide will probably tell you 3 years and 1 day. It's genuinely not true. What it says in the legislation is maturation period no less than 3 years. So I do not know where this 3 year and 1 day
Just to
rumor-
make sure you got over the
Yeah,
3 years.
Everybody says it, but
That's
it's
weird.
no less than 3 years is the
Yeah.
maturation period.
There's silly things like that with bourbon too, where you're like, wait a minute,
Well,
no, it
you
needs
still
to be
meet a
this.
remarkably large number of people that think you can only make bourbon in Kentucky.
Yeah,
Whereas,
it's still.
was it the 48 continental states you can do it in?
It
these
just
days?
needs to be in the U.S.
Yeah.
Right? Technically, it could even be in Alaska or Hawaii.
Oh, it is because
yeah.
they do that now, right? Okay.
Yeah, just as long as it's in the U.S.
But yeah, there's so many people that. I got in a proper argument with a guy recently.
I'm gonna go so I can enjoy it.
Yeah, if any of your viewers or your listeners are ever in Scotland, pop by, say hello, come and ask for Alex. I'll be here.
I'll put several links in the description for connection to you guys, so you can set up some tours or private tastings. Or you did mention earlier the restaurant. Talk
Yes.
a little bit about that, so people know about the.
Yeah, so that's been quite an unusual part of our history recently. So we always had a restaurant under the previous owners, but it was catered towards bus tours mostly. Whereas with the new ownership coming in, they have a history of fine dining. So we thought, well, let's try and do a fine dining restaurant in a Scotch whisky distillery. No one had ever done it before. So we opened it in July 2021. February 2022, it was awarded a Michelin star. And then February 2024, it was awarded a second Michelin star. So we're the only distillery anywhere in the world that has been recognised by Michelin, and we have 2 Michelin stars. This year we were named the 11th best restaurant in the UK and the number 1 in Scotland.
Yeah.
Which last month was our 3-year anniversary. So to have hit that in 3 years is amazing.
That's amazing. That might be my biggest regret of the trip, is not having a reservation to eat there. So on our next trip over,
we are sat in the restaurant at the moment, but we're just whiskey today. But
fair enough.
no, it's a testament to the team. Like our executive chef is a chap called Mark Donald. Mark's from Glasgow originally, so it's good to have a Scottish chef involved. Mark's trained all over the world, trained with some of the finest chefs in the world. And he's set up the restaurant from scratch, so it's really his baby. And the team he's got around him are just amazing. We've got young chefs of the year, and pastry chefs of the year, and all that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, that's amazing.
yeah, staff dinner is pretty good as well, which is
I can only imagine.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's top notch, right?
Yeah.
So any of you foodies out there, if you're looking to nerd out on the food, 2-star Michelin chef here at Glenturret. I don't have anything else. I appreciate your time and appreciate you guys for tuning into this episode. We'll talk more in the next episode about other types of whiskeys other than American spirits. So please like, subscribe, and share, and look in the bio and the description for the other details about Glenturret, the distillery, how to find it, how to find links to set up for appointments. And until next time, this is Bourbon United signing out.